He says that the duties of morality are what he calls categorical imperatives. Now, stated plainly, and this is in the text, and it doesn't sound very plain, it sounds fancy. The categorical imperative, translated into English from the German, reads something like this. Act such that the maxim of your conduct could be willed to be a universal law of nature. It's in the book. Act such that the maxim of your conduct could be willed to be a universal law of nature. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind when talking about this. An imperative is a command, folks. If something is a command, what we're saying is it's something that you ought to do. It is your duty to do it, to put that in the language we've already used. Now, when Kant speaks of maxims, a maxim is not just any old saying. Kant uses the word maxim in a little bit different of a way. A maxim is a rule that rational beings give to themselves. A maxim is a rule that you give to yourself. It's important that you give the moral law to yourself, because otherwise you may be doing it for non-moral reasons. In other words, if I'm only doing X because otherwise my father will spank my butt, I'm really not doing so freely. I'm doing so because I wish to avoid a punishment. Or if you say, love thy neighbor, because otherwise God will have you burn in hell eternally. You go, oh, I don't want to burn in hell eternally, so I'm going to love my neighbor. Well, Kant would say, you technically didn't give that law to yourself. You are following a command, and you are doing it under threat of punishment. That's not truly what? If there's a punishment there, strictly speaking, your free will has been taken from you. Because if you're only doing something in order to avoid hellfire, punishment, or whatever, your choice has been effectively taken away from you. Morality is something that you ought to do because it's it's going to sound so cliche, it's the right thing to do. The reason why you ought to be moral is because it's the right thing to do. Now, I didn't quite mention one other thing. Now, the reason why his primary moral umbrella law is called the categorical imperative is when we say that something is categorical, we mean that it is general and applies everywhere and across the board. Now, whenever the categorical imperative is applied to actual scenarios, practical situations, they become what are referred to as, I'll write this on the board here. When categorical imperatives are applied to specific and variable situations, they become hypothetical imperatives. Now, the reason we call them hypothetical is because they become genuine hypotheses about how we should act. Now, we don't have time to talk about all of Kant's examples, but I want to at least mull over a couple of them. One of them that he discusses is the prohibition of suicide. Now he says, suppose that a person is very, very depressed, feels that his life has no meaning and no purpose, and he thinks to himself, ought I to end my life or shouldn't I? Now he says if he is thinking rationally at the time, what would he do? he would step back and say, if I were to take my life right here and right now, not only would I not be doing it for moral reasons, because it would be likely selfish if I'm doing it with the end of ending my misery, my psychological misery. But he says, you also have to think of it in the universal. If you will suicide for yourself whenever you're down and out and in the dumps, you're basically saying what to everybody? Anytime anyone's depressed, they should just snuff it. He says, and that would be irrational. Because it is basically willing the extinction of dignified beings. Human beings have intrinsic worth. Willing the extinction of the human race is irrational. Therefore, it's immoral. Now notice, as a side, you would say most people who commit suicide for that reason are not thinking rationally because they're what? Depressed. Yeah, they're depressed. They're down in the dumps. So Kant understands that our emotions take hold of us. But remember, when you're doing moral reasoning, you're not supposed to let your emotions take hold of you. You're supposed to keep your emotions where? Repressed. Yeah, they're supposed to be completely out of the equation. You're supposed to just abstractly say, what should a rational being do? In other words, it's not about you. It's about what an abstract rational being should do.
46.
Oh, crud. Don't have much time here. Now let me give you example 2. He says that no rational being could will promise breaking. In other words, if you make a promise, you ought to what? Yeah, you have a duty to keep it. Now, by this extension, folks, Kant would argue that there is no such thing as a moral lie. Many of us think that might be under the impression that lying is sometimes permissible if it ends up helping people and having no real net negative consequences. Kant would say no. Even a little white lie basically treats the other person not as a person with dignity, but as a mere means. And I'll put this in Jack Nicholson type language here. It is akin to saying that you're not big enough to handle the truth. To tell someone a lie just in order to spare their feelings is basically say you're less than a dignified human being. You can't handle the truth. Now this is something that's important to highlight. Morality is not about spreading hedonistic happiness throughout the world. Morality, according to Kant, is not about making people happy. The desire to be happy in that sense is among our baser urges. As a matter of fact, morality might actually make people unhappy, but it makes us worthy of happiness, according to Kant. That sounds strange, I know. But yeah, according to Kant, morality might not actually make people happy in the garden variety hedonistic sense, but it makes us worthy of happiness. Because happiness ought to actually be gained from being a person who follows the moral law. In other words, it's not about creature comforts, it's not about having love and affection, it's not about the peace of mind of eternal life, it's not about any of that kind of stuff. The thing that makes you worthy of happiness, according to Kant, is to know that you've lived your life as a being who has tried to follow the moral law. Now we will do some wrap-up of this next time before we segue into utilitarianism. Read chapter 12 for Wednesday, and to keep us nice and on schedule, homework is due on Wednesday.